So this is Sarah Milligan with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the OSU Library. Today's date is May 2nd, 2017, and I'm here talking to Liz Wise about primarily about her relationship with what is now referred to as the Harn Homestead, but the Harn family in general is more what we're going to be talking about in some of those experiences. We're in Oklahoma City. That's it. Okay. I have to do the mental checklist. Okay, so I like to start with just something really general. Maybe tell me a little bit about yourself. We can start with a little bit of a rundown of sort of like who you are and who your family are, maybe a little bit about what your parents did. I know we're going to talk primarily about that. Just a little bit of context.
Okay. I'm Elizabeth Wise. I'm married to Dr. James Wise, who was born and raised in Stillwater. Should I look at you or the camera?
Look at me.
Okay. And that's how I got to know Dr. Sheila Johnson at the OSU Library. And we were up there, and I was introduced to Sarah, you.
Yeah, yes.
And I thought I have kind of an interesting Oklahoma history background from my family, and that your oral history program might like that. My parents were Billy Pat McCarty and Jane Harn McCarty. So my mother was a Harn, and she was born and raised in Oklahoma City and grew up at the Harn Homestead. When my grandfather passed away in 1953, 54, my grandmother was still living there in what I call the little house. There's two houses at the property, the big house and the little house. Tough names. Very tricky. Anyway, we added on to the little house, and my parents and my sister Lou and I moved in and lived with my grandmother. And then stayed on there after she passed away. And Florence Wilson, who was related to the Harns and has a big role in the Harn family, was living in the big house. We called her Aunt Bosie. And in 1967, she donated the property to become a museum.
Okay.
Having lived there most of her life. Okay. And so, brief family history on the Harns. There were two brothers in Ohio, George Upton Harn and William Fremont Harn. George Upton Harn, I can't count that far back. A couple of great grandfathers of mine. Okay, they were brothers, and they owned a newspaper. William Fremont Harn was also an attorney in Ohio. And to be honest with you, I don't know what happened to my great-great-grandfather, but I do know that my grandfather, who was also George Upton Harn, continued to work in the newspaper business after his father passed away. And so the main owner was then William Fremont Harn, his uncle. Uncle Free is what we called him, although I never knew him, but that's what everybody in the family called him. I don't know if he was asked or drafted by the Bureau of Land Management to come to Oklahoma after the land run and to prosecute the Sooners. And I think he did prosecute some Sooners, but I think he ended up prosecuting mostly what they call claim jumpers. So as opposed to the people that crossed the line before the gun went off, it was people that jumped claims after they were staked. So he was sent to Oklahoma to do that, and he obtained some property near what later became the state capitol, and which is now the Harn Homestead. I don't know how many acres he had to begin with.
160.
He started out with quite a bit. His wife's name was Alice Moores Harn. She was from Ohio also, but I can't remember where Aunt Alice was from. They had a young child, and the child died in infancy, and never had any more children. Alice had a brother who was a drama critic and worked for the New York Times, lived in New York City. And his wife passed away, and he had 2 young children, Dudley Wilson and Florence O. Wilson. And I think he kind of felt he wasn't able to raise 2 children. I'm not sure how old they were. I think they were pretty young. They were, I think, in grade school. Anyway, he asked his sister Alice to raise these 2 children. So they came to Oklahoma when they were young children and moved in with Uncle Free and Aunt Alice out on the homestead. Mr. Harn, when they first came, they lived in this little tiny shack, and I think he promised Aunt Alice lots of things. And I think she was a lady who was used to having her way and not having to scrabble around, but she put up with this and moved out here to this and lived in this little shack. And they eventually bought and built a catalog home. It was not a Sears catalog home. The Harn House knows the name of the company, but it was not a Sears home. It was another type of home like that.
It's one of those catalog
order, yeah.
Whatever, right?
And constructed the home, which is thanks to the the people that run the Harn House. It's still standing today. So they moved into the house, and then at some point in time, the 2 children came down to live here. And Florence ended up staying. She went to Vassar, was a 1912 graduate of Vassar, and then came back to work with him, with Mr. Harn, and to take care of him and Aunt Alice. And Dudley Wilson, I believe he went to Colorado School of Mines, and he ended up married to another family character named Amy Wilson, and they had a sheep ranch down in Plano, Texas. And this is very difficult to say, she showed sheep in the state fairs and everything. And anyway, she was quite a character too, but that's for another day. Anyway, Florence moved back to Oklahoma after college, and Alice Harn, her health deteriorated. I believe she had diabetes, and because I found several old letters from him writing to different clinics and seeing about treatments and cures, etc. And she died in the late 1920s, I believe. In the meantime, Florence was helping him with his practice. She was a women's liver before that term was ever thought of. But she was never, very verbose about it. She was just a quiet, very well-mannered little lady. She was very petite. And, but from what I understand, in a business deal could be very fierce and very tough. So she knew her stuff, and she knew how to take care of herself. And I think she learned a lot of that by working with him and for him in his practice here.
So he stayed as an attorney.
He stayed after the claim jumpers were, I guess, all satisfied or taken care of. He stayed on in Oklahoma and built up his practice. My grandfather, his nephew, George, at some point in time came down to Oklahoma, and they built the little house at the Harn Homestead, and that's where he and my grandmother, Margaret Llewellyn Harn, they lived and had 3 boys: George Upton Harn, Edward, I forgot Uncle Ed's name, middle name. He was an OSU graduate in horticulture, and my mother, Jane Harn, later Jane Harn McCarty, and John Robert Harn. So 3 boys and a daughter, and raised their family there on the little house. Mr. Harn died in the 40s, early 40s. I'm sorry, I'm not clear on the dates.
William?
Uncle Free, yeah.
Okay.
He died in the 40s, and Florence stayed on in the big house. And at some point in time, I think when my mother was a young lady, early 20s, before she had married, she and Bosie lived in the house together. But mainly in my lifetime, it was Bosie's house, Aunt Bosie's house. So, and like I say, we moved in with my grandmother when my grandfather died in 1954. And I was in first grade, and we had when at the time I thought I was deprived because we didn't have next door neighbors, because we had all this land around us, and even though our address was 307 Northeast 17th Street, and even though there were houses all along Northeast 16th Street and south of there, there was this huge 6 or 8 foot high privet hedge that separated us from those houses, and we had a graveled private road that came around the hedge, and there was, signs, private road, and so we kind of lived there by ourselves. And but when I look back on it, we had a great childhood. We had all this open space to run and ride our bikes. And at the time, the property north of the house was not developed at all. Mr. Harn, Uncle Free, had given half of the land that the state capitol was on. He had donated that, and I think Mr. Chartel was the other donor of the other half. I'm not sure. So that there went part of his land, and then I remember the Oklahoma Bar Association built their building there, and so they bought some land. The Jim Thorpe building was already there, so there was the Capitol, the Jim Thorpe building, and what was then the Historical Society, is now the Oklahoma Supreme Court. And then the Oklahoma Bar Association was going to build there, and I was quite astounded that my aunt would sell to this bar group because she was a teetotaler. And anyway, so then there was the Oklahoma Bar Association. And over time, I think she sold off more and more of the land. The Oklahoma Transportation Department, Workers' Comp Court, the Department of the Libraries. Over time, all those buildings were built. None of those were there when we grew up. It was just a wide open oil field. There were oil wells dotted all over that land. Right. And we used to go riding our bikes on the oil field roads, and stole a ladder one night and tried to take it out and climb up to the other ladder on the oil derrick, but they were smart enough to put up very tall ladders.
How old were you when you did that?
Oh, how old were we? My sister was probably 13, 14, and so it would have made me, 11, 12. So, didn't work. But the good thing about growing up there when we grew up is, we used to, and just about anybody that grew up during that time, we used to, doors were unlocked. We rode our bikes. We'd ride our bikes up to the state capitol on summer evenings and run around up there and play. No adults, nobody was around. Nobody bothered us. There was a little shopping center across Lincoln Boulevard at about 17th Street. It was on the other side of Lincoln Boulevard. It's still there. It's not anything like what it was, but you'd had to ride up this hill, and we called it going to the hill. And we'd ride our bikes up there, and there was a drugstore and a grocery store and I think a TG&Y or something, you know, barbershop, all those things that don't exist anymore. Anyway, so we just rode all over the place and on our bikes and felt very safe, and we're very safe. So I like to tell people that the Harn House is not a museum because of anything I ever did, good or bad. But when Bosie had a really great sense of history and how important the Harn family was, and I wish she'd been able to do an oral history. So when she decided it was time to move and time to sell, she decided she didn't want to sell it. And she was friends with George Shirk, who was, I don't know if he was at that time, but at one time he was the mayor of Oklahoma City. And George Shirk was also a history lover, and I don't know if he had a formal employment relationship with the Oklahoma Historical Society, but anyway, he was very, very big into Oklahoma history. And so she talked to George Shirk about it, and I believe the first donor of the property was the city of Oklahoma City. And I also believe that the 1889ers Society was going to be the hands-on, kind of like the curators and operators of the museum. And I think there was kind of a hands-off policy for us to kind of let them do their thing. And so we, as a family, just kind of backed off and stayed out of things. I mean, Rosie did whatever she could to, you know, to help them along. But as far as going over there and saying this is how it should be done, and we were hands off, and you know, that was the end of our life at the Harn Homestead. I think it's gone through a couple of other creations, legal creations, and now I believe it's run by its own foundation. And they have a really good curator and a lady who's in charge of their accessions and stuff over there now. And not to put any of the other curators down, but I believe Michelle is the first formally trained curator that's been assigned over there. So, and they have a lovely board and people who really are interested and take good care of it and do their best. They do a lot of things, which I think is great. A lot of things with school kids. When I first found out that they weren't open on the weekends, I thought, well, what's wrong with that? And then I realized their main focus is as kind of as a learning area for the kids. I've even been there with one of my grandchildren, Reagan. We went with her school, and really good stuff. They have an old schoolhouse. They have the kids go in and, you know, sit down in these by age, you know, they sit by age and in these little school desks, and then they hand them out their computers, which of course are little chalkboards and and things like that. And then they have them play some games, the old with the hoop and the
stick in the hoop
stick in the hoop and jump rope and marbles, and you know, nothing was electronic. And they all found that very fascinating. I think they were able to entertain themselves and have fun, and it didn't have a plug attached to it. So, and then they showed them how to make rope, and they let them be involved in that. They have a couple of automated, to the extent that they're milk cows, and you can go in and actually milk a cow and feel like what it's like. They don't kick or move around or do anything that other normal cows would do. And then they show them how to, I think they have a place where they can pound and grate some corn and make it into cornmeal, so they get that experience. And of course they got to tour the house, and I got to show my granddaughter where my room was, and show her the closet where I would hide when I was deathly afraid of needles, and they still had doctors that did house calls. And when my grandfather was dying of cancer, the doctor would come visit him, and so I would always go hide in the closet so he wouldn't sneak up behind me with a needle and get me when I wasn't looking. But so that was fun to be able to take her there and share that family history with her. There was a lot of family furniture that did not stay with the home. A lot of it Florence took with her.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. And I understand there's been some criticism of the museum over that, but
why would there be criticism of the museum? It was what she wanted to leave, right?
Well, I think other people don't quite understand that. And also, to be fair, a lot of the furniture that was original to the house was no longer in existence. And I think they were very interested when they first started in having it be the 1880s, early 1900s.
The Pioneer
yeah.
House or whatever
And so a lot of that furniture had disappeared.
Over almost 100 years.
Yeah. So it wasn't, quote, authentic to the time furniture. So anyway, and there's...
Okay, I make friends everywhere I go.
Okay, there's our friend, the kitty cat Patrick is making his... Alice Harn was an artist.
Oh, I know what you're doing.
And
I want my water.
And she had trained in New York City herself and had formal training as an artist, and been able to donate some of her paintings to the house. We had so many of them that a couple years ago, my cousins, we had a Harn family get together, and I took a bunch of paintings and let people pick. We went by birthday and let people go around the room one at a time and pick out paintings. I think we got to go around the room 3 times. So, and there were about 25 people there. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So,
how did you end up with so many of her paintings then?
I think when she passed away, and obviously when Mr. Harn passed away, Florence inherited just about everything. Her brother, was down in Dallas. I remember from going down to their house that they had some paintings, but I think Bosie got most everything. And I stored and toted these paintings for a couple of decades after my mother passed away, and finally decided they're just sitting there going, no one's appreciating them. And so I thought other Harn relatives ought to have some. So
was it something that she commercially tried to sell, or was it a hobby for her?
I think it was just a pastime, especially as her health declined over the years and she was less and less able to travel. But I know she was a member of an artists society. They had a state artist society, and I know that she was a member of that. I don't have any records of any sales of her paintings. So I think she just did it for her own enjoyment. And
what sort of things did she paint?
She painted a lot of landscapes. I don't recall any portraits that I found that she did. It was all landscapes. She did pencils, she did some watercolors, and she did some oils. And she did some of the Harn property. There was one I know that my mother called the Belle Isle. And there's now a shopping center there in Oklahoma City called the Belle Isle Shopping Center. And at one time there was a power plant there. Well, when my mother was young, and when Aunt Alice was a young woman or a younger woman, there was a lake out there. And I think that's kind of where they went to have picnics and stuff. So she had a lot of paintings of the weeping willows and things out there at the Belle Isle Lake. So, and I like to say we have a catalog and a historical significance, but everything was just kind of thrown in an envelope, like I say. Some of them weren't even signed. So, and a lot of them weren't even dated. A lot of them that were signed weren't dated, so she didn't follow that too closely. Sorry about that, but anyway.
I do have a couple of questions just to back up a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think how. There's a couple of different things. Maybe we'll start with your. Oh, I guess. Wait, was she great third cousin? I'm trying to think. What would she be related?
I think she was a cousin. We called her Aunt Bosie, but
yeah.
I think she would have been a cousin. So I guess Aunt Bosie sounded more dignified than cousin Bosie. And she never married.
Do you have any sense of that? Like why she never married? Or?
No, I don't. I don't know if there was a long lost love that never never came to fruition, or if she was just so focused on taking care of, I think myself included, her generation and probably my mother's had a greater sense of duty to family than we do now.
Yeah.
And
or possibly an expectation that as the only females
took care of everybody.
Yeah.
And she was the female child, whereas her brother, he married and moved away, and so it was on her to take care of everybody.
I think it's interesting though that she was raised by Alice. It sounds like who was, sort of a women's liberal, whether self-proclaimed or just that was her mindset.
Yeah.
And that Bosie went to Vassar and then came back and sort of filled this role.
Yes. I think as Aunt Alice's, maybe as her health deteriorated, Bosie took on the role of his hostess, especially after she passed away. He continued to remain very active in the community. I think he ran for the legislature a couple of times. He was never elected. And I don't know about early Oklahoma, but he was Republican. So later in Oklahoma, that wouldn't have been popular, even though we've gone around the circle again. But anyway, he was the Harn family from Ohio were big Republicans. I have some mementos of when President Taft was nominated, of their train tickets to go to the convention for the nomination and all that sort of thing. So they came a big long line of Ohio Republicans.
And into politics, and probably...
He was into politics, and like I say, he was never elected to the legislature, and he never held statewide office. He was, at one time, he was a court clerk for the United States Federal Court. And I also have what I call the backwards book. I don't know what happened or how it happened, but there were onion skin copies of his letters, some letters that he had written. And they're reversed. So if you want to read them, you have to hold them up to the mirror. Yeah, I don't know how that happened. Anyway, to get a good sense of him, and I need to spend more time with those letters, but looking backwards in the mirrors.
Kind of weird.
It is.
So
weird.
they're like carbon copies of something?
They're on onion skin paper, and they're in a bound volume, but it's reversed. It's so bizarre. But anyway, some of his letters were very, probably can be considered very liberal today, because he was talking about the plight of the Indians and how they had so little and how destitute they were, and how we as a society needed to do more to help them. He was very into, and so was Aunt Bosie, into education, and that was a lot of the focus of some of those letters, is of trying to raise the education opportunities for the Indians. Indians no longer being the approved term, the Native Americans, but
American Indians.
American Indians, yes. So I guess he had a lot of opportunities because he used to travel to Perry when he was court clerk, and I know he had properties all over at one point in time, little plots of land here and there, and so I don't know if he was a landlord or if he just, because of his law practice, met and interacted with these people. Or I do know that at one point in time there was a shed that is not recreated on the property, and my mother told me that during the Depression he used to take, in payment, he would take, people would give him a chair or a dining room set, or and that shed was full, and apparently somebody took umbrage at it, and it was burned down one night. And so he wasn't always a popular person. I think he had a tendency to irritate people sometimes.
You think irritate in, like, because of, for example, his attitude towards educational opportunities for Native Americans, or the class issues, or
who knew, or who knows now? There's no one alive that knows the answer to that question. So what little I did sort of find out about him, it sounds like he was in the real estate. It sounds like he did. That was the main focus of his practice, was real estate, and miraculously, oil and gas right there around the Capitol. I don't know how that happened, but so he had a lot of oil and gas interests, and got some great photos of him out in front of them drilling some of the wells and all that. So he gave up the newspaper business, obviously, when he moved down here. He was no longer involved in publishing. But for another little sidelight on Oklahoma history, he went to Worcester College in Ohio, and it's my understanding that Mrs. Gaylord, the original Mrs. Gaylord of Oklahoma Publishing, went to Worcester College.
Would they have been similar? Like, what generations?
She would have been probably in between him and Aunt Bosie, because when Bosie donated the property, we moved in as one family unit into a house together and moved to Nichols Hills, and just down the street from the Gaylords. And I know that they used to come over quite often and were friends. And Bosie's other, she was very big donor to the Oklahoma City Symphony, and I think provided some funds to them for a long time after her death. She was also a big, big donor to Oklahoma City University. And because we were raised First Methodist Church downtown Oklahoma City, and that was her church. And then Oklahoma City University was founded by the Methodist Church Foundation has a Methodist Church connection. And I don't know if they've changed it, but at one point in time, the president's home was called the Florence Wilson House out at CU. I don't know if they've changed that or not, but anyway. And she provided some voice scholarships. She was into opera. I remember she had this huge, well, it wasn't huge, it was a baby grand piano in the living room. And I never heard her play it, but apparently she had gotten that as her graduation gift from Vassar. So, and she would be all excited when there was going to be a New York City opera broadcast. And of course, I was this teenager and thought that was so square, So, but she was, like I say, I never heard her play or sing, but she was obviously into to music and the appreciation of music. So So she was a great philanthropist.
And that was mainly from what she inherited from
I'm sure.
Harn.
Yes. I think her dad. He obviously was not destitute, but I don't think he had the financial resources that Uncle Free and Alice did. I do know he came out to visit several times, and he eventually remarried. But she remained in Oklahoma. She never went back except for visits to New York.
So if she came back and really sort of settled there and took care of both of her surrogate parents, what was the idea behind your grandfather? Your grandfather? Yes, your grandfather moving here with his wife and kids.
I think it was. I believe when Mr. Harn, when Uncle Free left Ohio, I think he sold the newspaper, and so there kind of was my grandfather's livelihood, and I think he said, "Come out here and work with me." And my grandfather was an engineer. He had a degree in engineering, but I think he mostly spent his time working with Uncle Free. Let's go here. He was kind of like his since uncle, we called him Uncle Duty, Dudley Wilson. Since he'd moved off, he was kind of like his surrogate son, that son that he never had. And because they were obviously pretty close.
Yeah.
And I think that was another reason why even though my grandfather was elderly, well, doesn't look that old to me now, but he was in his late 70s and was dying of cancer. When he died, I think both my grandmother and Florence went, "We don't have a man here on the property." And, it kind of, my poor dad kind of got drafted. So here you are. You're now the man of the property. And even though he didn't, he didn't go around and tinker with things and fix stuff. I think they just wanted to have another, they'd always had family there. There'd always been a presence there. And
so your mom then grew up in that house?
My mom grew up in that house.
And then what happened for her to leave the nest? What was her story?
My mom was kind of like all girls. She had a younger brother, John Robert. Her two older brothers, I think, were born in Ohio. And then mother was born here. And I don't know the age difference between my oldest uncle and my youngest uncle, but I think seeing pictures of Uncle Bob, that he was much younger. I don't know if he was a menopause baby or just unplanned or what, but anyway, he was much younger. And I think my mother raised him, because I think my grandmother had, moved on to other responsibilities. My mother was, I think, a young teenager, and I think she was the primary caregiver for her little brother. And I think that, like a lot of women at the time, and unlike Bosie, she didn't go to college. And so she just, stayed home, did her domestic things. At one time, she told me she was asked by Kerr's, which was a department store, to be a shoe model, because she had these lovely petite little feet and legs, and my grandmother was scandalized and wouldn't let her do it. And so that was the end of her modeling career. And I know that she was married once before she was married to my father, and that didn't turn out well. And then she met my father, and they had a house. I drove by it the other day. And well, they had one house on the northwest side of Oklahoma City. And then when I was born, they bought a house at 1201 Northeast 15th Street. It's just up from the medical school, and that's where we lived. And it is probably less than a 5-minute drive to the Harn Homestead. And because I drove it the other day just to kind of see. And my father he was in the Army. And unknown to my mother, or to anybody, when he was in Korea, he had a heart attack. And so he was in his 30s. And he told my mother he had yellow fever. And I guess suddenly his mail was being sent to a to a hospital. And so when the Korean War was over, he went into the civil service field. And he ended up being I don't know what is GS 1213, civilian advisor to the Army Reserve Unit, because he stayed in the Army Reserve. And he was a civilian advisor who kind of ran the place from the civilian side. And then he was the sergeant major of the unit. So he basically ran the unit. So that's what he did. And I saw some of his pay stubs the other day and went, how did we live on $375 a month? With 2 children and all this. But I'm sure it helped when we moved in the Harn Homestead and didn't have a house payment. Yeah. But anyway, that was his job. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And again, I look back, you have more of an appreciation, I think, as you grow older. And she would, make some of our clothes. And how she did it without a zigzag sewing machine, I'll never know. But I was looking at some of her stuff the other day, and she's a pretty good seamstress. And she took care of my grandmother in the house, and I think did a lot of taking care of Bosie, even though Bosie was in really pretty good health up until her final days. So she toted kids to school and to Brownies and picked them up and took us to ballet, and she was just an all-around good mom. And that was, like I say, we were pretty middle class. Kind of want to say leave it to Beaver, but she didn't wear pearls and high heels, and so but pretty middle class, just everyday people. So
you had Bosie and your grandmother, who was married into the family, were sort of the last one standing of that sort of middle generation.
Right. And all the brothers moved away.
All your brothers, or all your mom's brothers?
All my mom's brothers, yeah. George went to Dallas. Ed went to Bentonville, Arkansas. He was apparently friends with Sam Walton before Sam Walton became Sam Walton. Yeah. And Uncle Bob went to Tulsa, moved to Tulsa. And so Mother was here. She was the one that stayed here. My father grew up in Oklahoma City, and he had 3 sisters. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, I'm not sure how they met. But he was a local boy. He attended the University of Kansas, but never graduated. I thought back on that one day, that when I graduated from college, I was the first one in my immediate family to be a college graduate. So yeah, kind of didn't even think about it. Yeah. So anyway.
So when your grandpa moved from Ohio, and you said that they built this little house on the property, do you know anything about that house, or was there anything
The construction of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think it was a catalog. It might have been. I really don't know. The part that we added on has, of course, been removed because it's not historically accurate for the homestead.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very interesting that I don't know very much about the construction of that house.
Because that would have been, well, let me not make assumptions. About what time period did he move there and they built this house?
He moved there in the early 1900s.
Okay. So around statehood.
Yeah. So
it wasn't too long after they built the big house. Then.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Because it seems.
And it might have been the shack that and Alice and Uncle Free started out in. They may have moved it over, or maybe that's where they started out and then built the big house where it is. I don't have any family records on that. I really don't.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah. Now my curiosity is I have to tell my grandchildren, yes, they did have cars when I was growing up, and we didn't walk 12 miles uphill both ways in the snow to go to school. But
didn't have to ride a horse.
No. But I do remember our first air conditioner, and I do remember our first television, and watching Ally Stevenson in the 1952 Democratic National Presidential nomination. That was what we watched.
That's funny. That's what you remember.
Yeah, isn't that weird? Yeah. And I remember, sleeping with the windows open and all this, and then getting an air conditioner, and wow. And while we were there, when I was probably in junior high, they decided that maybe there was some more oil on the property. And so literally as close as they could get legally to our fence line, they drilled an oil well, and that was a summer of great fun. Fortunately, they decided it wasn't worth putting the well in.
Who's they? The oil?
I don't remember who the oil. I think most of the oil wells were around there were owned by Sunray DX at the time.
Okay, so like the company to the property line for Harn Homestead, or for your house?
Our house. It was but it was right there. I mean, it was just right across. It's probably close to where the ticket office is for the Harn house right now. I mean, it was right there. I mean, they were 24/7 pounding and drilling and pounding, and people were driving because it was the first well that had been drilled on. I guess maybe Bosie had sold the property at that time. First well that had been drilled on state property around the Capitol in I don't know how many decades. So it was, for a while, it was a big deal. And I mean, there were a couple of times we came home and we couldn't get up our driveway because people had parked in the driveway to stop so they could look and get a better view. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So do you remember, I mean, you've talked a little bit about it, but I'm curious about this relationship of Bosie sort of as this property manager is not the right one, but
she was.
Yeah, but
she was the
responsible
owner.
For.
Yeah, she was the owner. She and her brother, and I probably think at the time because her brother and his wife had done so well down in Plano, I probably think that Bosie got the majority of the inheritance because, she was a female and she hadn't married, didn't have children to take care of her. But there was a sense of family there that had an obligation that had developed obviously years before I was born, and from the relationship of my grandfather with Uncle Free. And I know that there were some times when I got to do things that my parents probably couldn't have afforded to do because Bosie probably paid for it.
Like what would be an example of that?
Possibly even going to college. I'm pretty sure that she probably helped with that. The last 2 years of high school, I drove from Northeast 16th and Lincoln to 50th and Meridian, and I attended Putnam City High School as a tuition student because times were changing. It was the 60s, and there was some civil unrest, some busing issues, and at that time, if you talk to some people from Putnam City, they go, "We were already overcrowded. Why were you doing coming into our school?" They were a different school system. In the Oklahoma City school system, you had to live in that district, or at least start out living in that district. Okay, and so you couldn't transfer to another school just because you wanted to. Putnam City was accepting, I think there were 20 of us in each class, that they accepted 20 tuition students, and we drove every day
from outside the
district.
So help me understand why that was something that your family decided you needed to do. So what, elaborate on.
Well, it's kind of not our brightest moment, a shining moment, but my sister and I attended Dewey grade school, and then Dewey fed into Northeast High School. And Northeast High School was one of the first to become integrated, and there was a busing issue. And my mother was the more outspoken. I don't remember my dad. I kind of think my dad just kind of went along sometimes with the women just to, okay, whatever you guys say. But my sister graduated from Northeast in 65. And I still had 2 years to go. And my mother, I don't know what she thought my sister did to protect me, but she, and I guess some of these other parents that didn't want to move, had found this outlet of a place that was safer.
So was it a discomfort at the recent integration, or was it a worry of violence because of this unrest due to integration?
Both, and the neighborhood around us was deteriorating. When my mom grew up, we had a congressman named John Jarman. He was a longtime congressman of Oklahoma, and he was one of my mom's friends. The family were friends, and people all along in that area were well-to-do people. And over time, people moved out and away and farther out, and the area started to deteriorate economically. And it was less safe, probably. We started locking our doors. But we really never had trouble. We didn't have home invasions, or our cars didn't get broken into or anything like that.
Your shed didn't get burned down.
Our shed, we had a shed, you're right, and our shed did not get burned down. And I think our shed was like everybody's sheds. They're full of the stuff you should have gotten rid of a long time ago, but we didn't. But I think it was a combination of my mother grew up in a time when the races didn't mix. And I know there was one girl in my class who was black, and she wanted to be my friend, and she, for Christmas one year, gave me a necklace, and my mom made me give it back, and it was very painful. It's very hard to do because she was a nice girl, and so that was difficult. That was difficult. So I guess those 2 years, when I look back on it, I guess my mother stayed home all day every day because I had the car.
Right, you drove yourself.
I drove myself to school. For a while there were some of us that were in a carpool, and then I joined the yearbook staff, and I ended up being on my own because I had to stay late and everything. But I guess she wanted a car. She took my dad to work. And
So, was Bosie's decision to divest herself of the whole property line up a little bit with your high school completion?
the day after I graduated,
Yeah.
we moved. Yeah. I was going, why didn't you? I could have at least been a little closer for 6 months. But yeah, the day after I graduated from high school, they moved to the house in Nichols Hills.
I see.
And I think because of, and I mentioned earlier, my mom had spent some time living with Bosie when my mom was a young woman, and every day, because the post office wouldn't deliver mail to us, so we had a post office in what's now the building is the bankruptcy court, but it was the post office, and it no longer exists. But right across the street from there was an office building called the Harn Building, and that's where Mr. Harn had his practice. I think it's called Bank of Oklahoma. It was originally Fidelity Bank and bought that property and tore the building down decades ago. And anyway, so Bosie would go down almost every day and to the post office and pick up the mail, or her secretary. She had a lady who came in and worked as a secretary for her. On those days when they couldn't, that was our job, to go down post office box 424 and pick up the mail every day. And
so maybe back up a little bit to where you did mention that your mother had lived with Bosie for a little while. What were the circumstances that she moved into the big house?
I think her parents said, isn't it time for you to go find somewhere else to live and something else to do? And I think my mom kind of worked as a secretary for Bosie at that time. Uncle Free, I think, had passed, and so I think she helped her out and worked as a secretary for her for a little while until she got married the first time.
So was she a teenager, late teenager then?
Or probably early 20s. Yeah. So I think they had developed a relationship, and then when my grandmother died in 1960, we stayed on the property. The reason I was telling you the post office story was when Bosie would pick up the mail, she would stop every evening when she'd come home, and she'd stop at our house and drop the mail off and have a little visit, or if she was going off to the symphony or something, she'd just go on. And during the day there was daily contact between us. And when she was gone on one of her trips in the summer, she traveled a lot in the summer, and when she was gone on one of her trips, because some of them were at that time were maybe month-long cruises, or she had a friend who was a language teacher at Northeast, and when Mrs. Snedeker would have her summers off, they would travel together. And so we'd take care of the house, and so there was a strong connection there, especially between the adults. That was there from a long time before I ever came on the scene. And so kind of a sense of family and obligation, and that I think that was the reason why Bosie didn't want to sell the property. She wanted to keep it as probably as a tribute to Uncle Free and Aunt Alice, as much as a tribute to its role, whatever that role was, in Oklahoma history.
Yeah. Well, and maybe you notice, maybe you don't, but you can infer that probably is not, maybe a little bit of nostalgia, but also that sense of it's family land and it's family space, and it was obviously strong real estate. So I wonder what the impetus was. Why give it or sell it to the city, and why not pass it down into the family? Even if she didn't have kids, there were.
I don't know if it's that generation I think there was a sense of history that we don't have anymore. I think there was a sense of, and I miss it for my grandchildren. I started first grade with people that I graduated from high school with. And that sense of continuity. And at the same time, I think she really had a historical perspective. Like I said, I think she was way ahead of her time in her thinking in many, many ways, even though I never gave her credit in her lifetime for that. But I think she had, and there was a strong sense. I was always told, this is Harn property. This is Harn this. This is Harn that. And, at one point in time, that was a big deal in Oklahoma City. And probably not so much by the time I was around, but there was a strong influence of this is our family. This is our property, even though we gave up control of it, but I think that was her way of kind of keeping the Harn legacy together. So,
well, yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, did your parents ever give you any indication that they were disappointed that it was sort of managed that way? Or
no. Aunt Bosie took very good care of my parents financially. Sadly, about 2 years after they moved, my father passed away. So my mother and Bosie became even closer because they lived together. I was in college. My sister had gotten married. And so they would travel some together. And they just became closer and closer. And so kind of a mother-daughter thing without the baggage. So.
Well, it sounds like they had a good relationship, even over the course of over your mother's life.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, though. I just want to pick at this a little bit more. I think it's interesting that a lot of times when you hear of these sort of family legacy physical places being turned into these historic homes or historic properties, or wanting that legacy to remain as sort of a museum sort of thing, it's usually like written up in someone's will. Like they want to live there until they die, right? Or they get dragged off the property. But there's not, I don't think, at least my experience, it's more uncommon to hear of this sort of planned sort of removal or, donation while the person is still pretty active, right? Like
It was unique in that there was so much land. I mean, kind of right in the middle of Oklahoma City, even though a lot of it had been sold off and over time developed, there was still so much open land there. So I think that part was unique. And like I say, a lot of the big names who might have grown up around there and started out around there had moved on to Crown Heights, moved on to Nichols Hills, moved on to different areas where the families had left the area, or
I see.
And I think the size of the property, I think because of Mayor Shirk's interest in downtown Oklahoma City, I think and I don't know if it was Florence's idea or his, or somebody they met at the symphony. I don't know whose idea it was to do that. I just know they were very, very close, and he was very involved in this transition. And so I don't know exactly where the idea generated from, but the size of the property and its location in the middle of the city, I think, is probably one of the biggest influencing factors.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that makes sense. And I wonder too if the size of the property got too much to take care of at some point.
Most of it, we had this wonderful man named Hartree Boyd, a black man who worked for the family, and bless his heart, he could neither read nor write, and I don't know when he came. Around World War II, he came to work, and when we moved out to Nichols Hills in 1967, and during my college years, and long after that, actually, because I remember I was practicing law when Hartree passed away, he would drive over to the house every day, and he and my dad had the greatest adventure one day when they finally got a riding lawnmower, and then so Hartree would take care of Florence's property. He would mow around Aunt Bosie's property, and my dad would mow our property.
When you were still on the Harn Homestead.
Yeah, when we were still there. And Hartree, he got to the point where he was doing less work outside, and he was, spending more time inside and dusting and all this stuff. But Bosie would buy him a car ever so often, and my dad would go out with him, and they'd pick out the car, and Bosie would pay for it. And every once in a while, Hartree would have a little car accident, and so we'd get a new car. And I'm sure Bosie took care of those expenses, but he would come every day. And
so it sounds like he was sort of a caretaker for the property.
He was a caretaker for the property. There's a little building on the Harn Homestead that refers to the man's house, and that was Hartree's. It wasn't glamorous, trust me, and it was not. I don't even think it was air conditioned, but when he wasn't working in her house and he wasn't working outside, if he needed to rest or anything, that was his place. I remember there was a cot in there for him, and I think he had I don't know if he had a desk or anything, but he had a chair, easy chair in there, and that was Hartree's domain. So
he didn't live on the property.
He didn't live there. He was married to a lady named Oni, and they lived, I remember going to their house, but farther northeast, probably out, probably out past Martin Luther King Street, which was Eastern at the time. So
yeah. So he was still doing work for your family after you all moved to Nichols Hills?
Right. I graduated from high school. Like I say, 1967 I graduated from high school, and I would come home from college with these giant suitcases, and my mother would say, well, just leave those there, Hartree will get them. Well, Hartree over time had, bless his heart, had aged, and I probably outweighed him, and I didn't weigh that much, and bless his heart, and I would go, oh, okay, and my mom would go around the corner, and I'd go, I'll get those, don't worry about it. And bless his heart, he'd let me, because they were heavy. And he still kept coming. And I don't know when I don't remember when he stopped coming, because I remember the trauma of my mother trying to find a housekeeper. But because even though they had this big house now in Nichols Hills, Hartree had still helped with the vacuuming and the dusting and everything. But I started law school in 1979, and I was at this one particular firm from 90 to 95, and I remember his funeral was while I was at that one firm, so he but he had not, I don't think he had worked there for several years. I mean, over a decade. But I think he was left taken care of in Bosie's will. And I know he was remembered. And I remember my mom going to his funeral. So she was still in touch with them, even after he stopped coming.
So I wonder how he got connected with your family and the Harn property in the first place. Is there any sort of origin story there?
No one's told me that story either, unfortunately. These are all great questions that when I go back in time, I intend to ask. And I hope to have these answers someday, because they're great questions. And I was just a thoughtless teenager and never...
Sometimes we just don't have the answers.
Yeah.
But
it's a good question. Perhaps I'll work on an answer.
I was about to say, I'm sure it can be really creative.
So.
It just seems like it probably corresponded within a few years, probably, of when your Uncle Free died.
Oh, yeah.
So it was either before that or a year or two after
that. He came, and it might have been hired because Uncle Free maybe needed some help up and down the stairs or something like that. Because he was obviously a lot younger then.
He could carry
He could carry the luggage then. So, bless his heart.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder.
I think his wife Oni for a while did some domestic work at the house too. So
so he was with your family for
he was. Oh, my friends.
20-30 years.
When we moved to the house in Nichols Hills, a lot of my friends from Northeast had already moved out there, and we were still, seeing each other in college, and they remember driving by. And they said this one patch of grass this one tree they were confident was getting watered well, because they drive by the house and there was old Hartree sitting out there just holding the hose. And every time they drove by, he was sitting there at the same place. So they used to tease me, did we ever let him go home? And so he was kind of a family institution. So, and like I say, I never had any deep conversations with him, because I don't think he really wanted to, mess around with trying to deal with teenagers. But just always a very kind and gentleman, and obviously very trusted, very and relied on, and so he was a good person, good caretaker for not just the house but the family. So.
Well, and it also sounds like a lot of your family friends had either over the years moved to a place like Nichols Hills, or maybe sort of relocated other places, either family associates or friends. I wonder if that was part of the reason too, that
to relocate.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
That was part of it. There was a robbery, which is what precipitated the move. I said we never had any home invasions, but we had one. And
were you all home for it?
It was Florence's house, and she came home one night, and there was a couple waiting for her in the house. And they, after that, she said, "I can't stay here. I can't live here by myself anymore." And when we had built the addition on our house, we had built an extra large bedroom with its own bathroom for my grandmother. And so at night, Hartree, when he would leave in the afternoon, after that incident, he would walk her over to our house, and she would spend the night there. And then in the morning, when Hartree came to work, he would go in the house first and make sure it was safe, and then she would work at the house all day and do her schedule. But if she went out to lunch or something and came back, then there was somebody there at the house all the time. And that happened in November or December of 66. And May of 67, we were no longer there. So.
You don't have to answer this, but I'm wondering how that situation resolved. Were you all close enough that you could help, or?
Oh, yeah. I answered the phone when she called. They left her tied up to her chair. She was tied to her chair in her den, in her office.
So she came in and they basically...
And they were there, yeah.
Tied her up.
Yeah, because they thought she had, she was a wealthy lady. It was pretty much a secluded area. Mm-hmm. And they thought she had a lot of money in the house, and she didn't keep money in the house. And so they basically roughed her up. Compared to today's standards, nothing. I mean, she had a couple of bruises, but she stayed tied up, and she called, and I could tell that there was something wrong with her voice. She said, "Let me talk to your father now." And so the dad goes, "He's on the phone. I think you better come now." And my poor dad, bless his heart, grabbed the only weapon we had, which is his BB gun, and goes running out the door and over there. And the next thing I know, it was like, red and blue lights and all kinds of activities going on. But she wouldn't let my dad untie her, because she said the police will need to see this and take notes on it. So she'd gotten one hand loose enough to get to the phone. And which is, a tough little lady. And but she wasn't tough enough, and I don't blame her, that she was traumatized enough that she could no longer, I mean, she lived in that house since she was a kid. Mm-hmm. So she could no longer stay there. Don't blame her. So that's how it came to be.
Yeah, that would be something that would be a marker.
Yeah. So the museum doesn't like that story to be told, so we don't make it part of the museum history. So
you can have history, and then you can have what you like to tell the public.
Yeah.
You still have to have history.
Yeah. So.
Well, but I think that's I actually do think that's really important, because it illustrates what you're talking about the development of that area over time. Because when your great-grandfather, your great-uncle, mm-hmm. when they first moved there, it was just open space.
It was.
Right?
Fields.
Just fields, right? Mm-hmm. They bought 160 acres. The state capital moved from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. They gave up about 40 acres towards that, and it's still this huge area. And it sounds like he, over time, developed, I think, Heritage Hills, right?
Yes, there's Mesta Park. There's a little park there, and I've been meaning to go there. Maybe you'll motivate me to go there. There was a little park off of 13th Street, and I can't ever remember the north-south street. And I think at one time it was called Alice Harn Park, and I think he made that in her honor. Mm. And I don't know if the plaque commemorating that is still there, but he was going to call it Harndale. And I had some blueprints and stuff of Harndale, which I found and again toted around for years, and I finally donated them to the Historical Society. So, but they were the plats of how he was going to develop Harndale, and I don't know at what point in time that became Heritage Hills instead of Harndale.
But it was Harndale originally.
It was
right?
over in that. Yeah, if it wasn't that, it was Mesta Park.
Okay. So it developed into one or the other, or those two kind of. That's interesting.
So.
Well, but those were nicer homes.
Oh yeah, and a lot of those homes at that time were falling into disrepair and. In
the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. By that time, that really shows how much any area of a city can change over that period of time. And that's almost 100 years, 90 years, or 75, 80, 90, somewhere there. So you go from, sort of being the almost epicenter of all of this new
Sure.
wealth growth, just sort of, you know, being sort of a little bit worried about,
Yeah.
you know, your neighbors.
Right. And then they have to go through the regentrification, I guess is the proper term.
Right.
And because I've noticed on
Yeah, that's changing again.
the street in front of 16th Street that some of the houses have been regentrified. A lot of, I think, interest from the medical center over there. And the house right next door to them might look like it's about to fall down, and maybe they're waiting for it to fall down so they can buy that one and fix it up too. But yeah, it's kind of a resurgence and a kind of going through a cycle. So happily, I'm happy to see it coming back and people taking an interest and not just bulldozing all the homes and you know, getting rid of them, kind of taking the time to love them back to their beauty. Yeah. So.
Well, but that's also why people. I mean, your family obviously loved that area. I mean, loved the.
It was a big part of our growing up. It was. So.
So tell me about what it felt like going back with your granddaughter's school group.
Oh, well, that was fun. The first time I went back to the Harn House was way before that, and they do use it a lot for social events in the evenings. They don't. The houses aren't open, but they had built an event barn to kind of reconstruct what the old barn was like, and they've been very smart in doing that because they have a lot of functions there, and because of the wide open spaces that you can have outdoor activities. First time I went back there, I just sat down on the front porch and cried. It was hard. I hadn't ever been back.
Yeah. What were you feeling that brought that?
A huge sense of loss, and I think a huge sense of grief that I never went through. When I was a teenager, because I just graduated from high school, my mind was on other things, and to realize how important it was kind of shocking to me. I mean, it really was. It was a surprise to me that I felt that emotional about it. And over time, I've been back more and more often, so it's less and less devastating every time. It's not devastating, but at that time was devastating. So it was really fun to go back with my granddaughter because it was kind of, kids are like I was. They don't take time to listen to you about, when you grew up. And not only she, but the other kids that were with her were asking questions. And, kind of gave her a little cachet,
Oh, yeah. That's major cool credit.
Oh, I heard her saying, well, just one of her friends, well, this is my family. So, just waiting for her to start bossing everybody around. But when she come by naturally. Anyway, it was great fun to kind of relive those memories because I had taken the girls there once, and Reagan was only 4 or 5, and bless her heart, that day she was just worn smooth, and she had a meltdown that day, and we had to leave, and we hadn't been back since. So it had been like 7 or 8 years. I had, not tried. Well, they're only open during school hours and that kind of thing. So I just never had found the time to do it. So I was really glad. That was kind of neat. How lucky am I to get to show my grandkid where I grew up, and this was my room, and I remember doing this, and and a lot of people can't do that. Can't go knocking on the door. Hi, I grew up here. Would you mind if I brought my grandchildren in?
Oh, and I'm sure the difference in what's changed and not changed is probably.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny to go with her now because it is the older, even couple generations before me, furniture and things, and to say now this was not my bed. I had a real live bed from Sears. And we had dresser drawers and things like that, and I didn't wear these bonnets or anything like that. But anyway, so that part I mean, how lucky am I to be able to take her there? And so this is the dining room, and this is, you know, I remember we had this table. Remember out at Uncle Jay's house, and he's got that big dining room table. Well, that was the dining room table that sat here. That's my nephew, and I don't know. Our family's never been able to call people cousin, but anyway, they call him Uncle Jay. And when my mom died, my sister and I, my sister already had a house, and we just went through and, you know, worked out fine. Which do you want? What do you want? Blah, blah, blah. So a lot of that. But my sister was a lot more into antiques than I was at that time. So she took, like Uncle Free had this roll top desk, and she took that, and she took the old dining room set. Because when we moved, we combined the two houses.
Yes.
And Aunt Bosie had a lot of really nice, pretty furniture, and a lot of the things from Uncle Free.
Mm-hmm.
And when Mother died, my sister and I allowed the Harn people to come over and look at the things that we didn't want and select some things. And unknown to us, we were naive and didn't know to ask for a list and a receipt, and to make sure that the museum had a list and a receipt. And some of those things aren't there. So that's sad.
Yeah.
For us, it's sad because we wanted them to be part of the house.
Yeah.
So.
Did they just not make it back there in the first place, or they just haven't survived generations of management?
I don't think they ever made it into the inventory.
That's so unfortunate.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Or if they did, they weren't documented, and somebody sometime later.
Someone snagged it.
Yeah.
Into the session, right?
Yeah. So. Because there's a family. There was the Harn cradle, and my grandfather had been in that Harn cradle. My mother, my sister and I were both pregnant at the same time, and she'd had the cradle redone for our children. And so I have pictures of my daughter in the cradle, and unknown to me at that time, at one point in time, my mother and her younger brother, the one that she had raised, had a tiff over the cradle. He said that he was supposed to get the cradle when their parents died, and more than a decade later, I guess maybe he was wanting it for his grandkids. Mm-hmm. And the mother said no, and so they didn't speak after that.
Oh, gosh.
Anyway, so that was one of the things. My sister and I looked at it and went, this should go to the Harn house. Neither one of us should have it. It should be part of the Harn. And that's one thing that's missing. That never made it. So that was kind of devastating to, if nothing else made it, we kind of wish that had to kind of bring closure and put it back where it belonged, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But somebody's enjoying it, I hope, somewhere. So
I hope. I do too. But that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, and so I think that's also an interesting point about this entire process, because you said that once that transition made, it was a very clear understanding that the living Harn family would not overstep bounds for the property.
Correct.
There's been several decades in between that time and now. You still have that sort of sense that not that you're trying to dictate anything to anybody,
right?
But sometimes distance makes those relationships change,
right? And the personalities too. And I think the gals out there now that are in charge have been very open, very pleasant, mm-hmm. very easy to work with, and I'll give them credit. I took some stuff out there the other day, and do you want this? And the acquisitions person said, we really don't have a place for it. And I said, that's fine. My feelings aren't hurt. Mm-hmm. I just want you to have first chance at it. If you want it, fine. And if not, then that's fine. I know you're not, because I've talked, about some people bring things out there that are beloved by the owners that it's hard for them to, because they don't want to hurt their feelings.
No, it's responsible of them to be able to follow their collection
It
plan.
It is. And so I think we have a good working relationship, and I'm very, very happy. I always feel welcomed out there. And there's one day not too long ago, I took a friend out there, and there was a lady there with a granddaughter, and they said, you might want to follow her around. She used to live here. so they were following me around, listening to the stories. So that was nice.
That's nice.
So yeah, and I love that they care about it. They have a board that cares, and the curator and the acquisition. Well, everybody that works out there. They care. Somebody asked me once, well, you should go out there and volunteer. And I said, no. Well, first, emotionally, I couldn't for a long time. And again, I say, even though a lot of time has passed, and I don't think I have that kind of a relationship with the property, but I wouldn't ever want anyone to think I was getting too bossy about what should be going on out here at my house. So.
Well, and you mentioned that the first time you went out there after you all moved, the sort of sense of emotions, and I'm curious if that was as much because it was like that was the end of your family's relationship with that property, and that was sort of the finale part, or was there something else there? The changing lands, like it changed so much, or what was the real?
I think it's saying goodbye to your childhood. And I think at the time, if I recall, I had probably was close to the time when I lost both my mother and my sister. So, I'm the last one that's lived there, that's alive. And wow, that makes me feel very old. But it's kind of like figuring out the college thing. But I am the last person that's lived on that property because my cousins never lived there. They'd come and visit, but they never lived there. And like I say, when I lived there, we didn't do anything historical or anything, but it was just no,
it was your house.
yeah. And it went, to be honest with, if we weren't in a neighborhood, and so it was a little different from what my friends, when they come over, we'd run around like hellions. If we did that in their neighborhoods, the parents would get called. But we could scream and yell and play cowboys and Roy Rogers and shoot our little cat pistols and everything and not bother anybody. And the only thing we couldn't do is roller skate because the driveways were all gravel, so I could never. I'm a deprived child. I could never roller skate.
That's right. You were obviously kept away from the finer things in your childhood.
Yes, it was terrible.
I'd love to roller skate on.
So.
Well, I think I have one more thing I just want to clarify. On that vein of things. So after you all left and you did sort of have that understanding that you wouldn't be dictating, did you ever get any indication from Bosie, like how she felt about that?
Bosie was very proper, and she would never say anything that shouldn't be said. But I think at times Bosie was a little angry, not angry, miffed. I don't think she ever regretted that's if she had to leave, that's how the property was disposed of. I don't think she regretted that at all because she probably planned on dying in that house, and she was alive another 12 years after this. So I don't think she ever regretted that. I think she was proud of the fact that it was still living. It was a still existing entity. But I think that she was a little bit miffed about being told to keep her distance. So I don't know, once it was dedicated, if she ever went back there. I don't know.
Did your mom that you know of?
My mom went a couple of times. My mom was probably not as reserved as Bosie about her feelings about it and the personality conflicts. So my mom was kind of like, well, if you don't want my help or don't, then
Take my cradle and I'll go home.
Yeah, I'll take my cradle and go. So, yeah, I wish my sister and I hadn't been so naive about making donations. I guess we thought, well, we don't know what we're doing, but they should know.
It sounds like they do now.
They do now, yes, and that's the good news. They're very good stewards of what they have. Because I overstepped my bounds because I've been looking. One of the things that got lost somewhere was our family Bible, and my cousin Bill was wanting the family Bible, and I got all these literally these big Bibles, and I'm flipping them over, and there's nothing. They always recorded every births and deaths and everything. I don't know what ever happened to the family Bible. And the last time I was out there, we were going through, and there was this big book on the desk, and I said, do you know what that is? And the curator was very nice. She said, we don't open it very often because it's very fragile, but I don't know, so I'll go look. And it was a dictionary, not a Bible. so I kind of used my influence. I was kind of hoping maybe we found the family Bible, but anyway, that's gone too. But that was, I don't know whatever happened to that. So as much as they were stewards of the family, I still have copies of deeds that from property that Uncle Free bought or sold, or it's meaningless property. Can't find the family Bible.
Well, that's also often. So did you end up with a lot of those papers then? I did, because my sister, when my mom died, my sister was sick at that time too. She would have been a much better steward and organizer, but she sadly passed away not long after my mom did. So I ended up with stuff. And my mother, I remember just sitting there sometimes, on weekends, and we'd go over to visit her, and here's this big box of, well, I went through these papers today, and got rid of, I'm sure it went through a lot of these old deeds and things like that, but, and unfortunately, they didn't always write people's names on photos, so I've got all these photos of these people. I have no idea who they are. But you think they're family, probably? Some of them I've kind of been able to look back at old pictures finally when I get a chance to lay things out. And there's some of them I finally figured out were Dudley Wilson's classmates from college, and I don't know who they are. I wish I'd just written names on them or something, because I did find some stuff of Florence's, which I've got to relocate, and from her years at Vassar, like her graduation picture and things like that. So I don't know if they care, but if it can find a home, they'd probably rather have it than, no offense, but I know my daughter and granddaughters aren't gonna. Yeah, the farther away you get from this generation, makes sense. That's an interesting next chapter of that part of the story. Yeah, so, but I hope that, the Harn Homestead will continue to exist for a long, long time. And I wish I would win the lottery so I would know that that would be taken care of. But, well, your families obviously did a lot. And I think they're aware of, if they ever have any millions laying around, I think they'll know that's a nice place to put the money to use. So I hope so. Well, you put a lot of resources into it. And it sounds like the plans are in place for longevity versus having the city be in charge of it or a
Right.
municipality or something like that.
And I think they found out that the municipality shouldn't. This is not something they're trained to do, or you know from your history that there's professionals that are trained to do this sort of thing. So
well, that's changing. That's changed over the last
oh yeah,
years too. I think in my head, I feel like I have a pretty clear timeline, so I think we covered a lot. I don't know if there's anything you feel like we missed talking about or anything you wanted to add.
I don't. I hope I didn't dwell on too many silly subjects, but
there's no such thing as a silly subject for oral history.
I wish I had more knowledge about the actual history of the place and about how Hartree Boyd came into our lives and things like that. But hopefully I've given you kind of at least a brief foundation of the Harn Homestead and how it came into existence here, and then as a separate foundation. And I think it's a historical place. I think it's on the historical register.
National Register, probably. I'm sure it is. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very unique.
It
situation.
Is. Yeah.
And it is surreal to think that there is still somebody who remembers living there.
Yeah, even though it's the 50s,
Yeah.
So, but it was a whole lot different than it is now.
But yeah. But it was still this island in the 50s. It's hard to believe that people lived in.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Like I said, I think the night that when Bosie had her incident with the people in her house, I think the police called and we had to talk them up. They didn't know how to get. They couldn't figure out how to get up there because we had a paper boy, the Oklahoman. Maybe that was because of the relationship with the Gaylords. But the paper boy, we would get a paper, but the U.S. mail would not bring. They said you're on a private road, and the people at the ends of the road wouldn't let us put up a mailbox. So that's why we had the crazy post office box. So yeah,
all the little things.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it was interesting, even though I was unappreciative of it and didn't ask enough questions, I still grew up at the time with a sense of history. I'm growing up in a kind of a sense of history, not a sense of greatness like Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson, but a sense of history nonetheless.
No, definitely. It's still a visible one.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate you telling me about it.
Thank you for
being
interested
totally interested
in setting this up.